GIRLSCAMP, it's Girls Camp.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Girls Camp podcast. I'm your host, Haley Rawl. And if you're watching this episode, you might be wondering why I'm wearing devil horns right now. I am wearing devil horns because this morning, Bentley and I were setting up the podcast stuff, and one of my daughters found our Halloween stuff. Like, we just have a little box of Halloween stuff. And she found these devil horns that I wore last Halloween, and she brought them down to me and said, "Mama, you should wear these." And I was like, you know what? I think that feels very appropriate for today's episode. I hope you're ready to rage, because today's episode is about female rage. And I asked you all, what is the most rage-inducing thing a man has ever said or done to you? This was far and away the most responded to prompt of all time on Girls Camp. And I think that says something. I think we are all sitting on at least some amount of female rage. And I can't wait to vent together, get into it together, and just have a space to let some of that rage out. I already took the devil horns off because that headband was hurting my head, but you get the idea. I was actually sitting with my family at my brother's basketball game this past week. My brother is a senior in high school and he plays junior jazz. So he was playing basketball, teenage boy. There was just a bunch of teenage boys around because of the junior jazz league. And I was talking to my older sister because she used to teach high school, and she was kind of talking about high school boys and what it's like to teach boys versus girls. And I said, yeah, I think I have a lot of internalized rage toward men that I need to work through. And my little sister is always ready with the zingers. And she said, I don't think that's very internalized. She was like, Haley, we know that you have problems with men. And this is always such a funny thing to talk about because I am trying to stop myself from doing the whole not all men disclaimer, because obviously I feel that way. I am married to a man who I love very much. There are many men in my life who I love and care for. But when I'm talking about men here, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the stories that we are about to get into. I'm talking about the patriarchy that sets men up to think certain ways, that sets men up to see women certain ways. And then, a lot of men buy it. Or a lot of men are just conditioned to think that that's reality and, need to be exposed to other types of thinking in order to not be that way. Without further ado, let's hop in to your submissions. First one. I had decided not to change my last name when I got married. The ward/bishop automatically changed my last name to my husband's. I was pissed. It was such a simple thing, and it made me see how I wasn't my own person in the church. That's actually seems illegal to fully change your legal name without even your consent. That's not okay. Very messed up. I had to change my last name. I did it of my own accord. I actually wish someone did it for me because it was such a pain in the ass. But the reason that I ended up changing my last name so quickly is because I was working at the MTC when I got married. So right after I got married, they very strongly encouraged me to change my last name so I could get a Sister Rawl name tag as an MTC teacher instead of Sister Walker, my maiden name. And they needed me to legally change my name in order to get the updated name tag. So I went and changed my last name. I think I probably would have done that anyway, although I do think now that I am this far into my marriage, I'm not sure I would have changed my last name. And it's not even like, I don't know, I see why it's a big deal for people, and I think that's so valid. I don't think it's a super big deal to me either way. So maybe I would have just for convenience sake, I don't know. But I absolutely understand women who want to take a stand against that tradition of losing their last name and taking their male partner's last name. I know it gets complicated when it comes to, well, what last name do you give your kids, et cetera, et cetera. Definitely a personal choice, but I hadn't reflected on a long time how much I was pressured to change my last name. And once I changed my last name on my social security card, I think, then I ended up changing my driver's license last name, but my passport is still I'm pretty sure. Yeah, still to this day under the last name Walker, which has been such a nightmare for travel. I've occasionally brought the wrong document. It's just annoying and a really annoying burden that women have to go through that whole process to change their last name. Next one. I expressed to my male OBGYN that I was interested in giving birth in a position that was not on my back, specifically on all fours. He looked me dead in the eyes, smirked, and said, "Do you know how hard it is to push out a baby on your hands and knees?" I could hardly believe my ears and replied, "Do you?" That is such a badass response. I am so inspired by that. Do you, male doctor, know what it's like to push out a baby in that position, or in any position for that matter? No, you don't, and you never will. Needless to say, I dumped him and used an amazing midwife the rest of my pregnancy. I would love to send him a letter informing him I did, in fact, push my baby out on my hands and knees, and I plan to do it again. Rock on. I love that journey for you. When it comes to finding an OB, maybe especially in Utah, chime in if you live elsewhere and have this same problem. It's pretty hard in Utah, at least in my experience, to not kind of be faced with some of that mentality, I think. And my experience was different because I was pregnant with twins. I was always planning on an epidural anyway, whether I had twins or not. And I was also thinking it was likely I had a C-section. But I do think the just diminishing of women's desires and also women's pain in a medical setting is a very well-documented problem, just generally speaking. I know it's also much, much worse for Black women, which is another really important thing to note. And I also know that Black women have much higher rates of mortality when it comes to childbirth. More Black women die in childbirth, which is so fucked up, obviously. But I think anything in the medical field, you kind of run into that, but especially when it comes to taking care of women's health. I had so much rage when I was going through the process of infertility and doing infertility treatments because they still just really don't know all that much about infertility. So many women experiencing infertility are told that it's unexplained infertility. Like most people I talk to who are going through IVF, they've never really been given a reason why they aren't able to conceive themselves. And I always remember feeling so confused, like, why don't we know more about this? It feels like we should know more about this. And I just can't help but think that because it's a women's issue, that's probably why. Also, don't get me started on morning sickness, pregnancy sickness. You cannot convince me that if a man experienced pregnancy sickness for 1 week of his life, there wouldn't be some better medical way to treat pregnancy sickness because it's a women's issue, because it's women who are sick, sometimes for their entire pregnancies, 9.5, almost 10 months. For some reason, there's just like nothing that can be done. I don't buy it. And I think that morning sickness is not talked about enough. I think it is so completely miserable. And there's this thing as women, when you're pregnant, you're really grateful to be pregnant. I mean, when I was pregnant, I had just come off of doing IVF, so I was so grateful to be pregnant. And I felt so much guilt and shame about how miserable I was because I was so sick for those first 12 weeks. And it feels like even amongst women, you kind of feel this need to like downplay how difficult that can be or something. I don't know, but it pisses me off. Next one, my stake president, which is a Mormon leader above bishop, stuck his finger right in my face and said, "We may not be able to get him, my husband, but we can get you," referring to being able to excommunicate me. His reason? My visiting teachers had been gossiping about me joking about drinking at a Halloween party. We're going to run into a lot of double standards around how women are treated in the Mormon church. No shit, Haley, of course. But the double standards are everywhere and they are glaringly obvious. And so often things get pinned on women. And this stake president is like, well, it's probably going to be hard to get everyone on board to excommunicate your husband. But he was basically saying, since you're a woman, I don't think it's going to be as hard to excommunicate you. And he was unfortunately probably right. Also, for joking about drinking at a Halloween party. Joking about drinking at a Halloween party. Next one. My brother thinks all men were meant to be polygamists. Well, hopefully your brother's a Mormon because he's in the right religion. Actually, he could just go join the FLDS and become a polygamist if he really thinks that. But if he's a Mormon, even though he might not be able to be a polygamist here on earth, he will be a polygamist in heaven. So he's in the right place if that is his belief. It's such an icky entitlement thing, like this, thinking that all men, just deserve to have multiple wives. Next one. I went on a date with a return missionary who called me a whore when he tried to put his hands down my pants, and I told him to stop. This one gets me really pissed off. Stories like this, where the woman says, I don't want to do that, or a young man and a young woman have a consensual sexual encounter of some sort, and then the Mormon guy says to the girl, actually, I don't want to be dating a whore, or I don't want to be with a girl who would do something like that, even though they were also participating in the same act. This one is even a step further because she actually was saying, no, I don't want to do that. And then he had the audacity to say, well, then you're a whore. Also, that word is so awful, so terrible. And clearly this guy was just feeling slighted. And that was the easiest thing to fall back on, was using language like that towards this girl. I am so sorry. That's awful. Next one. Some man a few years ago on the Utah State Board of Education was against raising teachers' wages because, and I quote, they are bringing in a second income for their husbands. First, fuck you. Second, not all teachers are women. Third, fuck you. I don't know how I'm just putting this together. This is kind of crazy that I'm just putting this together. Maybe I've thought about this before, but it's hitting me differently right now. How teachers are, I think we probably all agree that public school teachers are underpaid. And I think the other profession that often gets talked about as being very underpaid is nurses. And nursing and teaching are not only very female-dominated fields, like there's more female nurses and more female public school teachers, but also nursing and teaching have kind of baked into the job these elements of caregiving, of nurturing, maybe even to some extent. And so I think those jobs are not only paid less because more women are doing them, but also because, of course, society tends to view caretaking roles as less important than, like, I don't know, being a lawyer or being a doctor, because the nurse is the one like really taking care. Shout out nurses. I like to shout out nurses any chance I get. I still think about the nurses who took care of me in the mom and baby thing after I gave birth at the hospital. That work is so sacred. I'll even use the word sacred. And it's so just some of the most important work that I think anyone on this planet is doing, is taking care of people when they are sick, when they are vulnerable. And I remember just thinking, like, I can't believe you're doing this for me. Like, anyone who's been postpartum knows when they're like helping you get out of bed and like clean yourself up and all of that. It's an incredible thing that these people do. Every nurse I personally worked with, this was in Provo, Utah, but was a female. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think there was one male nurse maybe in the NICU. He didn't work with our girls specifically, but anyway, I mostly worked with female nurses. I actually had a female OB deliver me, which was great. I really, really liked her. My anesthesiologist, on the other hand, was a male, and he sucked. I don't know how recently I've talked about my childbirth experience. It was a pretty traumatic C-section, so maybe skip ahead just a minute or so if you don't want to hear about that. I mean, I'm not going to get into the details, but the important thing here for the Female Rage episode is I was having a pretty severe panic attack. I got an epidural. My baby A, so because I had twins, it was baby A and baby B at that point, now Maud, her heart rate started decelerating. And so because her heart rate wasn't doing well, my OB came in and she was like, hey, no pressure. Usually I recommend, in this case, because your babies are premature, I usually recommend going to a C-section, but we can also like ease off the Pitocin. I had been induced because I had preeclampsia. And I was like, I felt good about doing a C-section. I was already feeling kind of panicky. I did not like the way the epidural made me feel. And then the anesthesiologist, the one who gave me the epidural, he had to come back in to be there for the C-section. And this guy, I was literally laying on the bed in the hospital, like struggling to breathe. I'm not joking. And he was making jokes left and right, like wisecrack jokes, thinking he was hilarious. And I was like, read the room. It wasn't also joking like to lighten the mood. It was like, hee hee hee, ha ha ha. And it wasn't funny at all. And it was the worst. Though I will say he did offer to play music when I got to the operating room, like right before my C-section. And I asked him to play Enya. And then he shut the fuck up. And I listened to Enya, which was much better than his jokes. Wow, this is feeling really good already. I always have something to say when it comes to men wronging women. We need to do this more often. Back to the submission that led me down that tangent about my wisecrack anesthesiologist is the Utah State Board of Education against raising teachers' wages, and someone saying because they are bringing in second income for their husbands. Not good. Not good at all. This is something I've actually really been trying to do better at and to check myself on, because I find myself just making assumptions, and I find myself asking women, working women, about childcare all the time. Whereas when I was in a corporate setting and I was working with men, I never asked them about their childcare situation because I just assumed that their wife was probably taking care of the kids. And yet when I meet a working woman, I'm always like, what's your childcare situation? Because I'm not assuming that her husband is home taking care of the kids. And it's a small thing. And I don't think, any of things like that are a huge deal necessarily. But I've just been kind of trying to think about that and think about how I just make these assumptions about women as well. And oftentimes I'll assume too, if a woman is working, that her income is also supplementary. It's not the primary income of the household, which is also just a gendered assumption to make. So I'm trying to do better on that one too. I find it absolutely crazy that in an actual professional setting where they are talking about how much to pay someone doing a job, gender even comes into the conversation. Also kind of ironic with everything going on with like DEI right now in the government, which as far as I understand, they're just trying to like eliminate any sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts on like a government level, because gender in this case does matter. It matters because of what this guy said when they wanted to raise teachers' wages. That man was looking at these teachers and not just viewing them as teachers, he was viewing them as women. And therefore he thought, well, they don't need to make as much money because it's probably a secondary income. I think it just goes to show that a lot of times diversity and inclusion efforts are looked at as like extra woke or something like that, when in reality it's like, no, you can point out just as many examples where someone who's not very woke, like this guy, is also using gender as an excuse to not pay women as much, which is why diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are really important to help make up that gap, because there already are these assumptions and these inequities, etc., etc. Next write-in. When I was single and going on dates, I had a friend of my cousin match with me on a dating app. He lived about an hour and a half from me. Somehow, he convinced me to drive all the way down to him and to bring him some of the frozen elk meat I had recently acquired from my sister so he could cook it for me. I love that this story centers around frozen elk meat. It's just very random. I myself have never had elk meat, nor do I don't know where you would acquire such a thing. It doesn't sound like they just purchased it, acquired from my sister. I don't know. Cool. Probably really healthy and more sustainable. So I drive the full hour and a half in my gas guzzler car and went through one full tank of gas just to get there. And it's a first date with a cute guy who is also close with my cousin. So obviously I was a little anxious for things to go well. Once I made it down there, he made me drive to go get some Wendy's, only got me a $5 biggie bag. And then when we got back to his house, he said, your anxiousness has got me tweaking, so I don't think I'm ready for a date today. I'm going to go inside and do some homework, but let me know when you get home and we can reschedule the date. Then he proceeded to get out of my car and go inside with my elk steaks in hand. So when I got home and had finished angry crying, I sent him a text asking for gas money. Nice. Because I had wasted all that time and gas for nothing. I received no text back and a measly $20, which didn't even cover half a tank of gas, let alone the usually expensive elk steaks I left. I was livid. What a loser. He just wanted the frozen elk steaks or whatever, and someone to go get him Wendy's. Also, him blaming this woman's anxiousness as the reason he didn't want to go on a date anymore, when obviously the guy's just, again, a gigantic loser who wanted someone to drive down and bring him elk meat. Go get your own damn elk meat, sir. My sister-in-law's ex-husband frequently received revelation for me, including but not limited to my career path and how it was too demanding to be spiritually beneficial to me, my future family and what they would prefer me to choose in any given situation, my struggle with, quote, dark forces after he sensed bad energy surrounding me, I felt fine, and an anxiety diagnosis after I chose not to go through the temple against my family's wishes because it didn't feel right to me, which began with him asking me to allow him to give me a blessing and then describing his revelation in front of all of my in-laws, who said nothing. This revelation apparently allowed him to see my broken nervous system and then showed me going to the same doctor he goes to and getting a prescription for anxiety medication, which apparently healed me. Let me tell you, I've never been more rage-filled than reliving that. Okay, I'm just making sure I understand this. This guy, so her sister-in-law's ex-husband. So that would be, okay, so if my sister-in-law, wait, that's why I'm confused. Because wouldn't a sister-in-law's ex-husband be a brother? Because if it's your sister-in-law, am I going crazy? Oh, I'm stupid. Sorry, I'm not stupid. I got confused, and I'm very intelligent. If your spouse's sister is your sister-in-law, then her husband would be your brother-in-law. So it's like if Bentley's sister's husband. That's even crazier. That's like if Bentley's sister's husband was all of a sudden receiving revelation for me. Crazy anyway that any man is given permission to receive revelation on behalf of women, which if you're unfamiliar with Mormonism, that's kind of the whole shebang, because in a household, the man is the patriarch of the family and therefore can receive revelation for the women in his family. So theoretically speaking, my dad was the one who could receive revelation for me. If my dad was absent, then it would be like the bishop of the ward or the stake president, or on my mission, it was the mission president, or if not the mission president, it would be my zone leader, which was like an 18-year-old dude, or my district leader, which was like a very strange 18-year-old dude. It's always the men who are allowed to receive revelation on behalf of the women. Really extra crazy that it wasn't even this person's brother or not even her like sister's husband, but her sister-in-law's husband. It's just way too far from her to have any justification for receiving revelation on her behalf. But it sounds like this guy was just telling her all these things that he had revealed to him, and then also gave her this crazy blessing, which told her to go get on anxiety meds, also from his own doctor. I cannot believe the in-laws didn't say anything. In-laws, we've talked about in-laws before, and maybe we need to do another in-laws episode soon. I think it was, I'll link the episode. It was like Monster Mormon in-law or something. It was like Mormon specific stories at that point. I feel like in-laws are on thin ice. No, I love my in-laws, to be clear. There's never been like bad blood with my in-laws. I think just getting married as young as I did, there was just a lot of working out that Bentley and I had to do around like spending time with what family and just things like that. But I love them. I'm very grateful. I have really good in-laws. But I do think that in-laws, it's like not, I guess I feel this way about any relationship, but I just don't like an entitlement in a relationship. Like, I have to be in this relationship because you're my sister-in-law or my mother-in-law. I think relationships should be there when both parties are mutually respectful of the other person. And I feel like when it comes to immediate family, it gets a little more complicated because you're blood related. It should still theoretically be that way, but it's like, well, if it's your mom or your sister, it just feels a little different. All that to say, no man should ever be telling a woman what to do in this capacity, saying that God is speaking through him to tell a woman what to do, especially when it's your sister-in-law's ex-husband. Next one. Last week, my luteal phase, skull, I get you. I was in a rage about men, how women automatically cater to them, how they think they're superior and immune to feelings, how we aren't supposed to be vocal, etc. I'm married and I love my husband and he is a good man, but he took it personally and ended up doing the exact thing I was raging about. He got upset that I was angry and then I had to comfort him and help him feel better, which is exactly what I was upset about in the first place. I pointed this out to him and I think he realized what happened, but honestly, I'm still kind of salty about it. Thank you for writing this in, because this sums up so well the conundrum of being a woman. And I kind of was talking about this in the intro, where I feel this need to say, like, not all men. I don't think every man is bad. And that should be obvious, but you still, or I still feel this need to, like, I was even thinking about this with this episode. I know I have people who listen to the podcast who are men, and I'm so happy. If you are listening as a male, that's great. I'm not like trying to chase men away, but I'm also not catering my content to you, and I'm not going to like cater this episode to you either. This is a female-centric space and gender queer, and so I still find myself like stressing out about that and feeling like, even though my demographic of listeners who are male is so small, it's like I still feel this need almost to cater to that small demographic, which is just weird. And I mean, I guess it's not so weird because I think that's what we've been trained to do. But I think also it's because, you know, as a woman, if you piss a man off, or if you even say to a man, even if the man, that individual man is not the problem, like, oh yeah, men can really be this way or that way, and then that hurts their feelings, then you're going to probably be the one to have to like emotionally guide them through that. I've been wanting Bentley to come back on the podcast because we went through it was kind of a whole process, our whole marriage. And I've talked about it here and there, but I think it was 2 years ago, maybe 2 Mother's Days ago, I did a TikTok about how the men in my family just like couldn't pull it together for Mother's Day. And the women were like planning where we ate and planning what the food was. And I was just so pissed off because I was like, this is one day a year. The women plan Sunday dinner every single other day of the year. And on Mother's Day, they can't just like plan one single dinner one time. I was really mad. I made a TikTok. It was really eye-opening. And the reason I bring it up is because I was kind of exposed to these two extreme camps. Well, there was a lot of people relating to me and saying like, I love my partner, I love my male partner in a heterosexual relationship, but there's just a major inequity when it comes to emotional labor, when it comes to these types of things we're talking about. But then there was a bunch of men saying that I'm a crazy bitch and ugly and whatever. And then on the other side, there was a lot of people who were like, divorce your husband, you're stupid for being with a man, that were very like ditch men altogether. And I absolutely, hats off to the women whose journey that is. I'm dead serious. Like, I completely understand that. But if as a woman you find yourself in a loving heterosexual marriage with a man, but you realize like men have not been socially conditioned to know a lot of this stuff and to do a lot of these things. And they get sensitive and they get defensive. And so when you're angry about these issues that are gendered, it becomes tricky to talk about. And I think I'll put a pin in that because I'm really proud of Bentley and I. And it took a really long time, and it took therapy and like a lot of learning and work on both of our parts. But I feel like we've really turned a corner around like emotional labor stuff, around taking care of the kids. And it was a battle. And not because Bentley was resisting, but just because of how ingrained these dynamics are in both of us. And anyway, maybe there's something we could offer to anyone who's like currently working through that. And even this person who wrote in, it's like, even the best men will still sometimes get butthurt when you're telling them about these types of things, when you're feeling that rage. And it sounds like this guy listened and hopefully you were able to talk him down, but it's like you shouldn't have to talk him down in the first place. And something I think about when I think about this too is thinking about race issues, like racial issues. And when I come across a Black creator, say on TikTok, talking about white people, I get that the first inclination is to be like, white people, you can't put all white people in a group and I'm a white person and I'm not this or I'm not that. But it's like, if you're not the person they're talking about, if you're not doing those racist things, then you're fine. Then you don't need to put the shoe on, right? But you do need to jump in the ring and also start being anti-racist and like focus more on that. That's my way of relating as a woman, is being like, yes, when a Black person is saying white people this or that, well, first of all, I'm not exempt from that. I'm not saying I'm exempt. And it's important to first self-reflect and be like, oh, maybe I am doing that, or how might I be doing that? That's the first step, I think. But then also, if you're not one of the people doing that, then you don't need to say, well, I'm white and da-da-da-da-da. That's the exact same thing, I think, as not exact, because they're obviously kind of different, whatever. But I think it's very similar, because that feels very similar to a man being like, well, I'm not that way. And it's like, then just let me complain about this, because you haven't had to deal with this your whole life. I have, as a woman. Rant over. Next one. My dad would always tell me I'm, quote, too emotional during any argument. I feel like this has been very meme-ified in the past little bit, where it's like the men who say women are too emotional to have a conversation with are the same ones like yelling curse words at the screen while watching football. Like, men are also very emotional. I think this obviously just comes from the fact that women, again, because of socialization, I think tend to be more in tune with their emotions because they've learned to do that. They've learned to talk about their emotions, especially amongst other women. And because men, that's not as acceptable socially, they're still emotional, but it ends up sometimes coming out more in like rage or tantrums or like screaming at the TV during a football game. But yeah, being told by your dad that you're too emotional is really annoying. I've been thinking about my dad while doing this episode and thinking about female rage, feminine rage, because a lot of my life and the things that I've dealt with in life are because of my dad, because my dad had an addiction. And addiction is super complicated because it's a disease. It's not like he was making these choices to like hurt me, but his choices did still hurt me in significant ways, which makes it really complicated. But the thing with my dad is he was a dad to 3 girls before, it's me, my sisters, the 3 of us, and then 9 years later, my little brother, and my parents got divorced soon after he was born. And I think about my dad being a girl dad, and I really appreciate, at least as far as I remember, my dad never treated me like I was like a dumb girl. He always treated me as like a very intelligent person and had the type of conversations with me that I can maybe sense that like a dad maybe would have more had with his boys if it was a different type of dad, And anyway, I'm grateful for that because I don't think my dad would never have dared say something like that to me. And I'm just sad that there's these misogynistic, sexist men who are even using this kind of thing and like weaponizing these stereotypes about women toward their own daughters and their own wives. It's really awful. Next one. Donald Trump. That's the submission. Yep. Yep. Next one. My father-in-law said to me, "It must be nice to sit at home all day and do nothing. I'm a stay-at-home mom with 2 children, one of them being a young infant. He later said he was just joking, ... So funny." You cannot be talking about stay-at-home motherhood as anything other than the hardest, most noble thing ever around me, or I will say something, and I have done. I'm trying to think if I can tell this story without like outing anyone. I think I can. I won't say who or how I'm connected to them, but I will say I was in a group chat and we were trying to make plans, and someone said, a man said, "I can't do that because I'm watching my child." I, without even thinking, I just, in a blind rage, I responded and I said, "It's not watching your kid, it's just being a parent," smiley face. Because I just cannot with the dad is watching his kids, but when mom is with the kids, it's just like, that's just being a mom. I know this is like a gripe as old as time, but I think it's a very valid one. I've been noticing this in myself because whenever Bentley goes out with the girls, and I also was thinking about this because Bentley actually has a friend who's he's separated right now from his partner. And not that it rocks that person is going through a separation, but that person is doing custody. And he also has another friend who is divorced. So basically the dads have custody on certain days. And so the dads will reach out to Bentley and be like, "Hey, let's take the kids to the park or to the museum or like go do an activity," which I think is unfortunately so rare for men to be initiating, like dads and children going to do things like that, at least from what I've witnessed. And it's interesting that men of divorce who have custody are starting to do that, And I think Bentley and, we have benefited greatly because I'm like, oh, awesome. Like Bentley will just be like, "Oh, tonight I'm taking the girls to the aquarium with so-and-so and their kids." Anyway, that should not be something to be like, woohoo, such a celebration. I think that should just be the standard. But I've found myself calling those daddy-daughter dates, or like telling my girls, like, "You're going on a daddy-daughter date." But when I take my girls to the museum, I'm not calling it a mommy-daughter date. That's just like what I do, even though I also work. And yeah, I don't know. It's just crazy how much language can like affect those sorts of things. And that's why I am very, very adamant about men not saying, "I'm watching my kid tonight." I'm like, no, you're being a parent. You are parenting the child who is half of your DNA. Or, maybe that's not always the case with biology or whatever, but you catch my drift. Next one. When I was explaining to my then boyfriend that I needed more attention because it felt like he wasn't acknowledging me as his girlfriend, I asked him what he was feeling, and he said, "I'd rather be playing spike ball with my friends." "I'd rather be playing spike ball with my friends," he says. Sounds like he has not matured past the 6th grade. Instead of having an important conversation about his girlfriend's emotional needs, he would rather just be playing spike ball with his friends. I hope, since you said your then boyfriend, that it's now your ex-boyfriend, and I hope he's having loads of fun playing spike ball with his friends. I hope that gives him all of the fulfillment out of life that he's hoping for, playing spike ball with his friends. Sounds like a really important priority, my guy. Next one. For our stake president interviews to get our ceiling temple recommends, both stake presidents asked to meet with both of us for a bit. Okay, so what they're describing here is when you want to get married in the temple, that's called a sealing. You have to meet with the stake president of your ward, but before you get married, you're usually in different wards. So they each had to go through their own interview worthiness check process, but it sounds like her husband went and got interviewed by his stake president, and then the stake president was like, "Bring in your fiance, essentially. I want to talk to you both." My husband's stake president told me that I needed to be careful if I ever choose to work outside the home or have a career. He explained that the temptation to cheat on my husband might be too strong for me to handle. He expressed that this happened to his daughter and basically implied that this could only happen to women. Well, did his daughter cheat with a woman in the workplace? Because if not, that was a man in the workplace. And chances are he was also cheating. So it doesn't just happen to women, obviously. Such a crazy and regressive thing to say as an excuse to discourage women from joining the workforce if that's what they want to do. I did some digging because I could have sworn there's a very specific quote from an old Mormon leader who says this exact thing, like women shouldn't work because if they work, they will go cheat on their spouses. Like they won't be able to avoid the temptation. I couldn't find the quote that I thought I was thinking of. So if you know it, please DM me. But I did find this quote, which is from President Spencer W. Kimball, which is an old Mormon prophet. And he said, "If you are married, avoid being alone with members of the opposite sex whenever possible. Many of the tragedies of immorality begin when a man and woman are alone in the office or at church or driving in a car." So, I mean, he included church in that, but that same sort of sentiment is implied that if women are alone with a man, like having a review with their boss or something, they're just going to end up cheating. Another double standard one, because for some reason, men are encouraged to go to work, and it doesn't seem to be as much of a concern if they are cheating at work or not. Speaking of double standards, get a load of this one. After being excommunicated for an extramarital affair, I found proof that my husband at the time had engaged in the same activity. I had by accident come across photos, definitive proof of the affair. Did I mention that he was also a member of the bishopric when the photos were taken? Anyway, after bringing this info to the bishop, yes, I was after justice, he basically said, "Okay, well, I'll let the stake president know." Did he face the same humiliation I did? No, of course not. He was friends with the stake president. They were bros. He received no disciplinary action, while I sat with my mom through a humiliating council where I was asked heinous questions about my personal sex life by two elderly men who decided my fate. I have since distanced myself from the church, who saw that coming, and so the excommunication means little to me now, but at the time it was a painful process and the shame took years to overcome. The fact that there is no resource for women who go through this and the men that get away with it is just one of the reasons we ex-Mormons just can't let it go. Talk about feminine rage. Talk about feminine rage indeed. So if you're not familiar with the excommunication process, basically there are certain sins, infidelity being one of them, that can lead you to have a disciplinary council where a bunch of male leaders in the ward ask you questions and decide if you should get excommunicated or not. And if you are, you have to be rebaptized. You're like kicked out of the church. So this woman got excommunicated for having an affair, but even though her husband was also in leadership in the ward and also had an affair, they didn't even send him to a disciplinary council. And she had proof. So she knew for a fact that he was cheating on her, but yet they didn't seem to care that much about that one. When it was a man in charge, they just didn't seem to care as much about punishing him. Also, disciplinary councils are I had to look up this word because I was trying to describe how I feel about disciplinary councils, which is that they are not only cruel, but they are so outdated. It's like, are we in medieval times or something? Like sitting around at a council deciding someone's like spiritual fate. So I asked ChatGPT and it suggested barbaric, which is a good word, but the word I was looking for is draconian, which is excessively harsh and outdated laws or rules. And I definitely think that doing disciplinary councils and excommunicating people is draconian. I wonder if that comes from like Dracula. Anyway, word of the day. In the FemaleRage episode, draconian. Makes sense. When I was in my first transfer, so this person is talking about on their Mormon mission, my district leaders gave me a secret hard drive and told me to put it in my phone. A district leader is just the male leader over like a group of 8 missionaries. It turned out to be a love letter from one of them declaring his love for me. It was pages long, and I'll never forget that he quoted one of his favorite songs, As She's Walking Away by the Zac Brown Band, and basically said he couldn't not let me know that he loved me. I eventually told the senior couple in the mission because I felt guilty. I was a 4-hour flight from the mission president and most of the other missionaries. The senior couple told the mission president, who then, at the following zone conference, had a meeting with me. He pretty much told me that the elders have a hard time controlling themselves around pretty women, and that I should be conscious of how much of my personality I let show because I was just so amazing. But I needed to be careful because it wasn't fair to the elders if I was super appealing and beautiful and a missionary. LMFAO, super fun way to fucking confuse me and make it all my fault. Tale as old as time. A missionary falls in love with another missionary and writes an inappropriate letter that is against the rules on a mission. You are not supposed to do anything about that. He fell in love. He wrote the letter. He quoted the Zac Brown band, which is also offensive. I don't know. I actually know nothing about the Zac Brown band, but they sound like they might not be the best. And then she's the one who gets in trouble for being so amazing and told to dampen her personality for the sake of the male missionaries around her. Ooh, that brings up so much for me because there is this sense, I think especially as a missionary, because I also served a mission in Berlin, Germany, and there is this sense that just existing as a female and like talking is bad because it might potentially be distracting to the young men around you. And it's just the worst thing to be told for not only the young women, worse for the young women, don't get me wrong, but also terrible for the young men to be instilling in both men and women's heads that like women need to dampen themselves, to not be as interesting, to not be as attractive in order for male missionaries to be able to focus on their work. I just hate that on so many levels. And I'm so sorry to this girl. How embarrassing also. Like, she shouldn't have been pulled aside to even be talked to unless to make sure that she was comfortable and okay. It should have been the district leader who wrote the letter who should have been pulled aside and told how inappropriate that was. It should have never even been her who had to answer for any of that. Next one. I worked my tail off for several years and applied for a corporate promotion within my department. I was informed my new role had been unanimously approved as the best candidate by the board and executive team, only to be surprised that a male coworker with less experience and work history secured the position. When I asked what happened, I was told it was because his wife was a stay-at-home mom, and since they relied only on one income, he needed the pay increase more than me. My supervisor let me know it wasn't personal, though. Back to the DEI thing and this whole idea of a meritocracy, because I feel like that's usually kind of the argument against DEI is like, let's just see who's the best. And the best person will rise to the top in this situation. Let's just see who's the best, and the best person will get the job. Well, looky here, though. The best person didn't get the job, actually. A man got the job because he was a man. And he had a, quote, air quotes, wife to provide for. It's just, again, a really good anecdote to show how those things happen. And that's why, like, you can't just remove gender from these situations because this happens. This woman was much more qualified. Everyone thought she should get the job. But then they were like, well, because he's also taking care of his wife, maybe we just give the job to him. This should absolutely be grounds for like a legal case against this company, especially if that was actually said to you. But that's the thing with this kind of stuff too, with like discrimination in the workplace or whatever, is even if something like this happens and you were discriminated against as a woman, okay, then you have to go find the lawyer. You have to go through the whole process of like trying to sue the company. It's not so easy, obviously, to just like sue if you're discriminated against. And also, it's really scary to speak out on issues like this because oftentimes, and I've seen this, I've worked multiple corporate jobs and I've seen this play out where a woman complains about a male coworker or leader or supervisor, especially around like them being weird or like saying maybe something that could be viewed as sexual, like the woman was uncomfortable. And then the woman, once they tell someone and the whole company goes through the process. I mean, in an ideal situation, it wouldn't be this way, but it ends up that the woman feels uncomfortable because then her supervisor knows that she complained, and then she now still has to work with the supervisor, but he now knows and doesn't get fired. There's so many ways it can play out, and it's just not so simple. And I think that's important to highlight because my first thought was like, well, you should sue them. But it's like, it's just not so easy as that, especially when you maybe like your job or you're not in a position to like go find another job or something. I'm mad. I'm enraged. Next one. And this one, I will say before I read it, is in honor of my dear friend, Kylie Kadich. You'll know if you know who Kylie is. I'll explain. I was at Home Depot to pick up some work gloves after mine got trashed. A random man walked up to me and said, "The dainty girl gloves are in the gardening section over there." He didn't even work there, and I wasn't there for gardening gloves. It infuriated me. As if the only thing a woman could be visiting Home Depot for is to get dainty little gardening gloves for her garden. You know, those DEI girls, my friend Kylie Kadich being one of them, that's why I shouted her out. They are sawing shit. They are painting shit. They are doing electric work. I'm in awe. And I think it's so badass. And I think it's such a fun pushback against this idea that that's a man's job when women are doing like these really intensive DIY projects. It's so inspiring too. I will admit I am the type of woman that if I need to like hang a picture on the wall, I'm going to wait until my husband can do it. It's just not my forte. But I also think it's just because I have this internalized idea that like, I don't know how to do stuff like that. And it's like, I'm smart. I could figure out how to do it. And people like my friend Kylie just doing it and figuring those things out and learning on the job and doing these things that are traditionally viewed as like a man's job is just so cool. And I hope Home Depot gets increasingly overrun with DIY women, because if there's a place where misogyny is at its best, I can imagine it might be at a Home Depot. Next one. One guy stood up at the pulpit saying that he was a worthy priesthood holder, returned missionary, and why should anyone think that he couldn't have a wife? AKA, why are girls rejecting me? And it could work out with any woman in that room, and they would be so lucky. Back to the entitlement thing we were talking about with the brother who thinks all men should be polygamists. I actually saw this infographic on Instagram just this morning, very apropos. I think I used that word right, that I will link in the show notes because it's really long. It's like a carousel of graphics, but it was talking about the male loneliness epidemic. And it was basically digging into these dynamics around how women are emotional caretakers for men. So when a man gets a wife or a girlfriend, it is often the case that the wife or the girlfriend is the one who's planning social activities, who's probably coordinating like gift giving for that person's family members and things like that. And then when a man is not partnered with a woman, then they start to feel really lonely because they haven't learned these skills of fostering friendships, of making emotional connections and keeping emotional connections. So without a woman, men get really lonely. Whereas women, if they're lonely, they're going to like start a book club or find some initiative, go whatever. They figure it out because they have those skills. Whereas again, men have not been given those skills. And this person who was posting was talking about the fact that calling it the male loneliness epidemic is not quite right because it makes it sound like something that's just happened to men. Like men are just so lonely right now. And I think it's a significant problem, obviously. And I think a lot of our current situation and a lot of things, like speaking about America, at least right now, are because of this with like incels and things like that. But her point was, it's not just something that magically happened to men. It's because men are not learning these skills or are not motivated to learn skills in order to like create rich emotional friendships and relationships for themselves without the help of a woman. And this kind of goes back to the fact that when most men are raised by women, mothers in the home, maybe their dad is not very involved in the actual emotional caretaking, then they're just used to women doing the emotional caretaking. I just found the whole thing really interesting, and I really liked how it was all laid out. So if you want to unwind after this episode a little bit while still simmering in some rage, I'll link that top of the show notes so you can check it out. I thought it was, again, like really powerful way of describing all of that. Okay, last story for the day. I was at dinner on a first date with a guy who didn't believe me and cared way too much when I told him that I don't smoke weed and I barely drink, and he kept bringing it up after the topic had changed. He then kept saying, "So you don't have any hobbies?" after I had mentioned playing multiple instruments, crocheting, and taking dance classes. Just overall shitted on the things I care about since they're more solitary hobbies. Our waiter came to give us the check. Knowing that I had no intention of ever seeing him again, I was desperately trying to pay the check, but he kept insisting on paying, eventually uttering the words, "It's okay, I'm not a teacher," as if that would woo me and as if I couldn't afford a fucking $30 meal just because I'm a teacher. I had my sister call and fake an emergency so I could get out of there. Not that I even needed an excuse at this point, LMAO, he had given me plenty. She claimed that she was at my house because her boyfriend had just left her and she didn't know where else to go. She lives 4 hours from me and her boyfriend was on the phone and in on the whole thing, LOL. The guy definitely knew I was lying about having to leave, but I never heard from him again. To this day, I still don't even know how to pronounce his name. And isn't that beautiful? So glad that we didn't even get his name because it doesn't even matter. What a terrible first date. And those of you out there on the front lines navigating dating as heterosexual women, I salute you. Sounds like it could be very difficult, especially depending where you live and things like that. This brought to mind a story I will end with of my own, which I think is actually kind of the genesis of a lot of my female rage. Obviously, I had like childhood stuff, as I've just talked about with my dad, but I had a boyfriend when I was a freshman in high school. It was like my first boyfriend, and he sucked so bad. The further I get from it, even now, I mean, I was 13 at the time, I'm coming up on 30, I still will remember things, and I think I'm kind of still uncovering like how much he fucked me up, to be honest. But I remember one night, this was the boyfriend, I posted this on TikTok, but this was the boyfriend who we were talking about. I was feeling really sad one day because my dad was going to rehab. And this boyfriend knew the situation with my dad's addiction and everything. And I was crying to him about it. And I was just, maybe we were in a fight or something. We were 13. I can't believe it. So little. But I was telling him like, yeah, I'm just having a really hard time because my dad is going to rehab. And he said to me, "I've always really admired how you've never brought that up for sympathy until now." That was his response to me. That's not even the story. The story I was going to tell is we were also on the phone another night. And I remember telling him, like, "I love this about you. I love this about you. You're so good at this. You're so great at that. I love your taste in music," like all of these things. And he was like, "Thanks, like I love you," or whatever. Also, again, why were we saying I love you at 13? And I was like, "Well, what do you love about me?" That man, that boy could not think of one thing, like floundering on the phone, could not think of one thing that he loved, admired, appreciated, liked about me. Like couldn't think of one thing. And I think that just goes to show why I have so much feminine rage, but also just like those skills, again, of how I feel like as women, and this is not the case for everyone. And I'm so excited to see friends of mine, my sister, like people having little boys, and also just seeing like this is improving. Hopefully, please bless. I think it is. But at least when I was in high school, I was like, this guy just doesn't even know how to like notice something about me and like tell it to me. He doesn't even know how to do that. Even though I could rattle off not only so many things about him, I could rattle off so many things about myself at that age and think how terrible that made me feel as someone who was like, I feel like I have all of these things to offer and my boyfriend can't even think of one thing. He sucked. Maybe I'll have to do like a whole Patreon episode just about how much my first boyfriend sucked when I was 13 and 14. Anyway, hope we feel like we got some of the rage out. It's always nice to vent. I actually, when I was making the reconstruction shift with the podcast, I had someone be like, oh no, is it all going to be positive now? Like, is it going to be like, let's be positive? No, I don't think reconstructing is inherently always positive. I think part of reconstructing is being allowed to be angry as a woman about the things that men have said and done. I think that's really important. I think sitting in anger and being comfortable with anger and not diminishing that or shaming ourselves for that is really valuable. And I think that's part of, once you unpack patriarchy and all of this stuff, like, you have to be able to talk about it. You have to be able to rage about it. And rage we will. I didn't even really skim the surface with the amount of submissions I got for this one. So we will revisit this topic another day. I can't wait to do it. Thank you. It's so much more fun to rage together than it is to rage alone. So thanks for being here. If you want to follow along on Instagram, you can find me at Girls Camp Podcast, Girls Camp Podcast on YouTube, Haley Rawl on TikTok. And if you want more content, I just mentioned the Patreon. Girls Camp After Dark is what we call it. Go to patreon.com/girlscamp for 2 bonus episodes a month. Talk soon. Bye.